I am honored today to introduce Brother Dan Cates. Dan is married to the former Shelley Jones. Together they have two children, Maggie, who was born in 1996, and she's married to Dylan Cooper, and Connor, who was born in 2002. Of course, Dan is the son of Curtis A. and Annette Cates. He is a native Georgian, born May the 2nd, 1970. He was reared in Alabama, Oregon, and Tennessee. His father and grandfather were gospel preachers, as are his brother, father-in-law, and brother-in-law. Dan Cates began preaching in 1983. He currently serves as evangelist and one of the elders of the Independence, Mississippi Church of Christ. Formerly, he worked with congregations in Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas. In 1991, he began teaching at the Memphis School of Preaching on a part-time basis. He was moved to full-time in 2013, and soon after was appointed Dean of Communications. He has taught various other classes in the 2- and 3-year programs, but is now teaching English grammar, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, New Testament Greek, wisdom literature, Christian evidences, Revelation, Bible archaeology, and the intertestament period to the 2-year students. He has also served as archivist for the Memphis School of Preaching. Dan Cates does a tremendous job, and I'm excited today by his topic. I'm glad to know that there's still a Cates preaching about Job, what Job learned about magnifying God. Brother Dan Cates.
I appreciate that. I especially appreciate the end. I wish it were the other Cates who taught wisdom literature preaching this lesson. Dad loved the book of Job. I think most everybody that's in here that knew Dad knows that. One of the students was walking by Dad's office one time, and the door was opened a bit. He noticed Brother Cates in there at his desk, and Brother Cates was crying. He stopped in and he said, "Brother Cates, are you okay?" Dad said, "I was just reading about Job." Dad loved the book of Job, and I think that especially during those last few years, he exemplified well a Job-like spirit. So I've been able not only to have sat under his feet learning about the book of Job, but I've been able to see him living out, and not to sound morbid, but dying what he had taught. And I'm grateful for that example. Before we get into the lesson itself, this has been a great week. What a wonderful study, Magnifying God. It was roughly 2 years and 2 months ago that we were in this room when the subject was announced. Little did we know that the study of magnifying God would be delayed. I think that's an interesting parallel, because God is not always magnified here. That magnifying is often delayed, but He will be magnified. But we are grateful that we have this opportunity this week to talk about these subjects, and in particular, to talk about this subject, what Job learned about magnifying God. The book has 42 chapters, so there are certainly many possible facets to this study. Ironically, though, not the one that some might expect. As many times as God is spoken of, as many times as His works are spoken of, not once in the book do you see magnify God. So that may be a bit ironic to us. This morning we want to do 3 things after we have taken a moment to go through the book and to get an idea of how the book is laid out, what's seen in the book. We want to consider the terms which indicate magnifying in the book. We want to see what Job learned about God which would have justified magnifying God, and ultimately what Job learned about magnifying God. For many, Job is a favorite book of the Bible. It is a favorite book because it deals with human tragedy, human frailty, and human resolve. It is a favorite because it contrasts the terror of Satan with the majesty of God. Job begins with an introduction to the godly man, Job 1:1-5, who was, in God's eyes, perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. Notably, the one who is describing Job there is God. I believe it's equally important to recognize that is not a description of Job merely from before his suffering. That description is one which is penned after the suffering. Now, verse 5, chapter 2, when you read the same thing, you could say that's before the suffering. This is introducing us to the book that contains the suffering and the, for lack of a better term at this point, resolution. The character of Job, after the beginning of the book, would very soon be tested nearly to the limit. Satan had been eyeing Job. He felt that God would see, if God would cease blessing Job, that Job would quit serving God. Chapter 1, verses 6-12. This attack effectively meant that God was only worshipped because of the blessings which he afforded. God allowed Satan to take away those blessings, even Job's children. Job 1:13-19. Job's response was not that which Satan expected. Rather than leaving his God, Job fell down and worshiped. Job 1:20-22. In fact, it's even more interesting than that because Job was on the ground. Certainly the shock of this repeated coming of these servants with bad news had knocked him to the ground. He was reeling. Before he fell down to worship, he got up to fall down to worship. Having lost the first round, Satan returned to God for a broadened mandate. If he could not have his way merely removing Job's blessings, perhaps Job would forsake God if Satan could torture Job to the breaking point, to the brink of death. Chapter 2, verses 1-6. Satan attacked Job with what must have been the worst symptoms of all of mankind's worst diseases. I believe that's the case because this is Satan's opportunity. Is he going to pull any punches? Everything short of death, Satan would use against Job. Job 2, 7, 8, and 12, 3:24, 7:3-5, 16:16, numerous other passages. We would note here that after the direct persecution of Job, Satan had exhausted his resources. In fact, Satan would not be seen again in the book after he afflicted Job. Now, Job's wife, who, we need to remember, lost all that Job had, save her own health, but she had seen her husband losing his. She urged him to quit his devotion to the God who was not intervening at his suffering. Now, we are at times very hard upon Job's wife, and perhaps to a degree that could be justified. I would remind us, though, that it was not she, but it was he who had the relationship with God as patriarch. He was the one to whom God was the one to whom Job, not she, had so often sacrificed. For her, this one that Job worshiped had abandoned Job in his darkest hour. She may have simply been saying here, even, let him go. Let him go. Regardless, while she urged that, Job 2:9, Job didn't. God had blessed Job. Now he was doing the opposite. But God had the right to do that. God could do as God willed, Job 2:10. Interestingly, Elihu is going to reason similarly, that God was punishing Job not out of sin, but was humbling him. So perhaps punishing is not the best word. 3 of Job's friends, aware of Job's suffering, journeyed to support their friend, but what they saw when they got to Job, in fact, when they saw him from a distance, was far worse than they could have imagined. Silently, they sat with him for a week, weeping with him. Job 2, verses 11 through 13. At the end of that week, Job spoke, wishing that he had not been conceived, or that he had not been born, or that he had not lived beyond his birth. Oh, that Job could be in the grave, not suffering as he was. That's Job 3. At this point, Eliphaz, apparently the oldest friend, felt compelled to speak. He would speak 3 times in the book, chapters 4 and 5, and 15 and 22. He would be answered 3 times by Job, chapters 6 and 7, 16 and 17, 23 and 24. Then the friend Bildad spoke. He likewise spoke 3 times, chapters 8, 18 and 25, and Job answered him, chapters 9 and 10 and 19 and 26 through 31. The third friend, Zophar, would speak a couple of times. He would speak in chapters 11 and 20 and be answered in chapters 12 through 14 and 21. There really is not a lot to be gained as far as answers are concerned from either the challenges of the friends or the answers of Job. Job was frustrated that they had not comforted him since they had begun speaking. Job 13:5, oh, that you would altogether hold your peace, and it, the holding of their peace, should be your wisdom. He even said sarcastically in Job 26:2 through 4, how, to what a great degree, hast thou helped him that is without power? How savest thou the arm that hath no strength? How hast thou counseled him that hath no wisdom? And how hast thou plentifully declared the thing as it is? To whom hast thou uttered words, and whose spirit came from thee? What we see on both sides was frustration. Job's frustration at their lack of comfort. In fact, he compared them to wadis, which appear to be bringing water, but when you get close, they've dried up. And the friends being frustrated. They were frustrated because Job did not accept their conclusion that he was suffering due to his own rank sinfulness. Job 32:1. We would note that Job thought that God was afflicting him. The friends thought that God was punishing him. Neither knew that the pain that Job was experiencing was not of God, but was of Satan. In fact, they do not learn that through the course of the book. A fourth friend, likely the youngest, Elihu, was likewise frustrated. He was frustrated because of the speeches of Job, his attempts to defend himself. Likewise, he was frustrated by the speeches of the friends who failed to bring very much of a case against Job. He waited to speak, but when he spoke, he got his money's worth. 1/7 of the book is dedicated to what Elihu said, chapters 32 through 37. Job didn't answer Elihu. Bible students through the years have debated whether Elihu was worse or better than the rest of the friends in his estimation and treatment of Job. It's interesting that in chapter 42, God tells Eliphaz, "You and your two friends have not said that which was right about me as my servant Job hath." He didn't bring up Elihu, which leads me to think that perhaps Elihu said some things that were correct and just, certainly not accusing Job of having sinned as to deserve the suffering. Some have suggested that he was accusing Job of sinning because of the suffering, not suffering because of the sin. Really, Elihu's case was that God was humbling Job, so Job needed to merely accept it. Ultimately, after the friends have all had their say, after Job had finished his speeches, God broke his silence. Job 38 through 40, verse 2. God did not, though, do what Job likely wanted for God to do, nor did God do what the Bible student today may wish God had done. You see, God did not explain to Job what had happened, and that Job was not suffering because of anything which either Job or God had done. What God did was simply established that he, not Job, is God. Job's humble reply indicated that he conceded the point. Job 40, verses 3 through 5. Then God spoke again, showing the vastness between Job and himself. Job 40, verse 6 through 41:34. Job again conceded the point. Job is not God, and God is not obligated to answer the creature. Chapter 42, verses 1 through 6. That's where the Lord's attention turned to the three friends. They needed to repent of their misspeaking. Chapter 42, verses 7 through 9. In the end, Job's blessings were restored. In fact, they were doubled. And he lived an additional 140 years, at the end of which, one of the most beautiful verses in Scripture, Job died being old and full of days. Job 42, 10 through 17. Having considered the layout of the book and being reminded of some of the relationships between the ones in the book, and certainly the relationship between God and all of those in the book, we want to consider the words which fall into this study of magnifying God. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word gadol is the usual choice for expressing magnifying. That word means to become great, to make great, magnify, grow up, grow, promote. It asserts the greatness of God. His works refers to magnifying the Lord himself along with his name. Paraphrasing Jodates. In Psalm 34:3 is found the imperative, "Oh, magnify the Lord." And interestingly, David spoke of God's magnifying his word above all his name. Psalm 138:2. As many times as we read Gadol, one might expect to find it in the book of Job, and one does. It is found in Job, but not with regard to magnifying God. It's found 4 times. First, it's found in Job 2:13, translated great with reference to the grief that Job was experiencing. One could say that Job's grief was magnified. Second, it's found in Job 7:17, in which passage Job humbly but frustratedly asked, "What is man that thou shouldest magnify him?" You see, Job did not want to be magnified at that time. Third, in Job 19:5, where the friends were magnifying themselves. against Job. Similar usages in Psalm 35:26. And then the words found fourth in Job 19:5, where the friends, in Job 31:18, in which the fatherless had been brought up or magnified with Job. In other words, he had known those that were suffering from his youth. None of those usages in the book of Job are with respect to magnifying God. There's another word. Another word is sagal. In Scripture, it's found only in the book of Job. It means to grow, to enlarge, to laud, to increase, to magnify, to make great, to extol. Its first use is not with respect to God's being magnified, but His making nations great. He increaseth the nations and destroyeth them. He enlargeth the nations and straighteneth them again. Job 12:23. Its second use is by the aforementioned Elihu, who instructed Job, remember that thou magnify not him, but remember that thou magnify his work, which men behold. Job 36:24. That's not magnifying God himself. It's magnifying what he's done. And that's a different subject. Brother Fawn spoke upon that subject on Monday and did an excellent job. The specific words for magnifying then fail to present the same picture in Job that one sees elsewhere. In fact, the closest thing was that magnifying of God's work. To find God's being magnified in this book, one has to go beyond the language itself to what Job learned of God in the course of the book that would justify God's being magnified. Job ultimately conceded, Job 42:3, I uttered that I understood not, things too wonderful for me, which I knew not. Job had spoken earlier before he had understood, before he had discerned, considered, or before he had known, before he had learned, perceived, discerned, or experienced. As we mentioned, Dad loved this book. Dad also loved literature. And Dad would often view the book of Job not as fiction, but from a literature perspective. As such, Dad would refer to Job as a developing character. Again, not insinuating that Job was fictional, but that art imitates reality. So Job is a developing character, and that development is seen through the troughs and the peaks of the seemingly incessant waves of the book of Job. In fact, the book of Job looks a lot like that as far as its ups and downs. In fact, many of those ups and downs could be seen just in one of Job's speeches. One verse could go from the depths of despair to the next verse, which was the height of expectation, and the next, despair again. In fact, some of the most sublime realizations of the future are sandwiched between despair. Yet Job's general course through the book is upward as he learns more about God. Now, before the trouble came, and then again we used the term resolution earlier. I don't really want to use the term conclusion, and even though I don't speak French and I'm not really a huge fan of French, denouement, and I'm probably butchering that, it is a better word for what's taking place in Job 42. Everything sort of comes together in the end of this book. But at that point, like he had at the beginning of the book, Job learns that God is gracious. God had blessed Job above all the men of the East, Job 1, 2, and 3. And he would again. Job 42, verses 10 through 13 and verse 15. The blessings would have been very difficult to appreciate when they had been taken away, but even then, Job could appreciate having had them. Job 2:10, 29, 5 through 7, and 18 through 21. In particular, Job 29:5, when the Almighty was yet with me. God had been with Job. Going back for just a moment in our thoughts, remember what we said about Job's wife? I don't know that God had been with Job's wife. God had been with Job. Job certainly would have told his wife, but I don't know that she ever spoke to him. No wonder she might have encouraged him to leave. God's general and special providence today continue. Matthew 5:45. But some even today refuse to see, either out of disdain for the benefactor, Romans 1:28, or being blinded like Job was by life's difficulties, Matthew 13:21 and 22. But certainly Job had an appreciation, and even did in his suffering, that God is gracious. Through the course of his suffering, Job learned that God is just. Ironically, God was inescapable. Job 7:20, 16, and 16:12, and yet he was inaccessible. Job 23, verses 8 and 9. Now that sounds like a contradiction. But in those first two passages, Job was wondering why he was a mark, why God had set Job as the target. And in the other passage, Job 23, 8 and 9, he said, I can't find him. I look this way, he's not there. I look this way, he's not there. That way. Some translations would even have the cardinal directions. Job's looked all around, and God is not to be found. But God is just. And God knew all, and Job would come forth as gold, Job 23:10, being vindicated for his obedience, Job 23, verses 10 and 11. While Job did not have access to that realization, the Bible student knows that God is so just that not only did he vindicate Job, but he had even given Satan his day in court, Job 1:6 and 2:1. While the idea is repugnant today, Thomas B. Warren pointed out that a just God can allow a righteous man to suffer intensely. We don't have time to develop that point, but I would encourage you to look at the old lectureship from Get Well and Living Messages of the Old Testament. I believe that's the book in which Brother Warren wrote a section on the book of Job and dealt with this idea that God could allow Job to suffer intensely. By the end of the book, Job's suffering had proven to be a trying obstacle, yes, but it also had proven to be the means to an increased resolve to face what was ahead. Job's wonderful attitude was not reflecting upon the pains of the past, but it was seeing things positively. All we have to do is look at Job's children's names. Karen, Hapuk, Jemima, Keziah, all of those names carrying some idea of either beauty or fragrance or affection. His terrible suffering ended in good. Yes, God is just. Though pained bodily and socially, Job 19, 17 to 20, and thinking that God was responsible, Job 19, 21, Job also learned that God is active. You see, God already had a plan, and it could be known, or at least reasoned. If only Job could give his side of the story, Job 19, 23 and 24, he knew that God would stand for him, Job 19, 25, and that he would see God, Job 19, 26. The Redeemer there is a person who could stand between God and man, and that Redeemer would be realized in Jesus Christ. Through dim view, Job could see through faith what the Bible student sees in the Word. Jesus was already active in the Lord's plan. Revelation 13, 8, Ephesians 1, 4 and 5. God is active. Through his and even the friends elevating God in some of their speeches, Job 11:7, 15:8, 28, 33:12, and other speeches, and through God's own speeches there in chapters 38 through 40 and in chapters 40 and 41, Job had learned that God is sovereign. Elihu concluded his speech, "Touching the Almighty, we cannot find him out. He is excellent in power and in judgment and in plenty of justice. He will not afflict. Men do therefore fear him. He respecteth not any that are wise of heart." Job 37:23 and 24. See, God and man are wholly different. Different quantitatively and qualitatively, as it were. God's nature is perfect. Man's is imperfect, being susceptible to temptation and sin. James 1:13 through 15, Isaiah 59:1 and 2. He, God, is creator, man is creature. In fact, we see a number of times in the book that Job was brought forth from the womb, chapter 121, 3, 10, and 11, 10, 19, 31, 18. Only God's condescending to man because of his love, John 3:16, could give man any access to God, Job 9:30 through 32. So that man could have that access, God created him a spirit being, Genesis 1:27. God did not need for man to have a spirit. He wanted for man to have a spirit. The Redeemer Job expected, Job 19:25, though for a time he could not see, Job 9:33, would come. The sovereignty meant that God knew and was working, but it also meant that God was not obligated to answer Job's question, why? God is God. Building on God's sovereignty is what was heard through the speaking of God himself. That Job learned that God is instructive. God is the master teacher. Dad wrote, when a person sits at God's feet in his school, being asked his questions, he is getting the best education possible. The world does not have, nor can it discover true wisdom. Dad was referring to Job 28. These are the things that Job learned about God that justified God's being magnified. God is gracious, God is just, God is active, God is sovereign, and God is instructive. By the end of the book, what had Job learned about magnifying God? In other words, what did Job himself reflect upon when he did have opportunity to speak again? Job 42:5, Job said, I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eye seeth thee. Job had not understood, he had not known, but now having heard, to hear intelligently, Job saw, to look at, inspect, perceive, consider. If the study is to consider what Job ultimately learned about magnifying God, then here in Job 42, 2 through 8, and in the words of Job 40, verses 4 and 5, must certainly be the answer. Job had learned that God is worthy of being magnified because he is weighty. Job 40, verse 4. In contrast, Job was vile. Now, often we hear the idea man is vile, and we think that man is worthless, that man is like a worm. The word doesn't indicate anything which would lessen man's spiritual importance. In fact, Matthew 16:26 would elevate that spiritual importance. But this idea that he was vile in Job 44 means that he was slight, trifling, of little account, or light. That's not to detract from man. That is to contrast him with the holiness of God, the greatness of God. And only when he has realized his own lightness can man even begin to appreciate God's greatness. James wrote, "Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up." James 4:10. Job also had learned that God is worthy of being magnified because he can do everything. Job said that in Job 42, verse 2. One will note that Job says this not after hearing about the eagle or the horse. Job says this after hearing about Behemoth and Leviathan. In fact, immediately after hearing about Behemoth and Leviathan. That only crowned the telling of those two creatures what God had said regarding his other operations of nature. Man, in all of his learned wisdom, has discovered amazing things. I enjoy seeing the great discoveries and when they have been made through history. But even in our day of technological marvel, man still knows but parts of his ways. How little a portion. Job 26:14. Sadly, hearing the pseudoscience foisted today, even what man knows, he often gets wrong. Moses said, "Unto thee it was showed that thou mightest know that the Lord, he is God. There is none else beside him." Deuteronomy 4:35. Job also had learned that God is worthy of being magnified because he can hear every thought. Job 42:2. Job wanted so badly for God to hear his plea. Job 31:35. God had heard. Job didn't know it. But God had heard every word, even perhaps especially the unexpressed words. When Job thought he was alone, which is again a sort of ironic thought because he also thought that God was constantly watching him. But even when he thought he was alone, in a "where is God when I need him" sense, God was there. He was listening and he was watching. He did know, even though Job did not know that God had known. David said, "O Lord, thou hast searched me and known me." Psalm 139, 1-4. Job also had learned that God is worthy of being magnified because God cannot be fully appreciated through human reason. Job 42, verse 3. Job was actually repeating in Job 42, verse 3, what God had already said in Job 38:2. "Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge?" Job had thought that he knew God, but wrongly. How the world today thinks that it knows God. God has been brought to the level of man, to the degree that man thinks that he is God. The world claims to know him. God had said, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Isaiah 55, 8 and 9. One day, every person on earth is going to appreciate that. Sadly, this is not that day, unless the Lord returns. Job also had learned that God is worthy of being magnified because God has let himself be seen. Job 42, 5. I don't mean seen in the physical sense. We understand that no man has seen God at any time. But he allowed himself to be seen in a figurative sense there in Job 42, 5. But Job only saw God because God revealed himself. Really, that's the only way any of us can see God, is because he's revealed himself. That's the message of 1 Corinthians 2, verses 7-13. That's the purpose of inspiration. That is the reason that we have the Bible. And then Job also had learned that God is worthy of being magnified because he accepts prayer and sacrifice. Job 42, 7 and 8. Job's friends had wronged Job. But more seriously, Job's friends had wronged God. And so they stood opposed to God. When man stands opposed to God, he needs to be converted. He needs to be restored. That would require sacrifice, as it always has and yet does. Leviticus 9:2, 2 Corinthians 5:21, 1 Corinthians 2:2, and 4:10, Romans 12:1. So these friends had to offer sacrifices. Now neither men nor angels, Revelation 22:8 and 9, are in the place to receive either prayer or sacrifice. So Job saw there in Job 42 that God is worthy to receive both because He is God. Just as the angel said, worship God. This book does not say magnify God, but the magnifying of God is a conclusion of it. Thank you.